In this video we shall discuss how to use stored procedures to execute dynamic queries. In the first task we have to create a stored procedure that compresses all empty values of a primary key of a table and returns the number of modified values. So for instance, if a table has such values of a primary key, the expected result is this. And the returned value should be 1, because only this value was changed to this, and these two values were unchanged. The expected result here is rather self-explanatory. It asks after the stored procedure execution, the values of the primary key of some table should look like this. It asks those values should start with 1 and go on without gaps. And of course the stored procedure should return the number of modified values. Let's start with MySQL. Here we have to create such a procedure with such a parameters. We pass the table name and the primary key name as input parameters, and we pass such a variable as output parameter. Inside the procedure body you may see such blocks of code, and that blocks are for debug only, so you may easily delete those blocks and the procedure will still work. But let's return to the main idea. Here we declare the variable to store the number of changed values. Then we are composing two strings that will contain the queries to search for empty keys and for maximum value of the primary key. As we may use dynamic SQL inside stored procedures, we use these names to insert in these strings. Then we have to prepare executable statements from those strings we've just seen. And then we are executing the loop with main actions. First we have to search for an empty key value. If there is no such value, we shall leave the loop. Then we have to find the current maximum value of the primary key. Once we have both the maximum value of a primary key and the empty value, we can compose that string to update the primary key. We shall explain this logic graphically in a couple of seconds. So here we are preparing the executable statement from that string, we execute the query, and we are deallocating the executable statement. The only thing left is to increment the counter and to go to the beginning of the loop. And once we exit the loop, we only have to deallocate these executable statements, and that's all. To test our procedure in MySQL, we may execute such queries. But please pay attention that once you've compressed a table, all further procedure executions on the same table will produce no changes. And of course, it's a good idea to make a backup of your database before executing these queries, in order not to break anything. And here is the visual explanation for this solution. On each iteration we are looking for the minimal empty value and for the maximal value of the primary key. And then we are changing that maximal value to that minimal value, and we repeat that again and again and again and again while we have any empty value for the primary key. Such approach, when we are changing the maximal value of the primary key to the minimal empty value of the primary key, allows us to speed up the operation a lot. With Microsoft SQL Server the general idea is the same. First we have to declare several variables, then we have to check if the primary key of the table we are updating is an identity field. As we cannot update identity fields, we have to raise an error here and we have to abort the whole operation. It asks we have to exit our stored procedure. Then we have to initialize the counter that stores the number of changed values. And here we are literally following MySQL approach. We are composing two strings for queries to select empty value and the maximum value of the primary key. And as long as we are using dynamic SQL here, we can use the primary key name and the table name, and we can put it inside the query. Then the main action happens inside this loop. And please pay attention that this is the infinite loop, so we have to exit it manually. The first action inside the loop is getting the information about minimal empty value of the primary key. If there is no such value, we have to exit the loop. Otherwise, we have to execute the query that will produce the maximal value of the primary key. And then we use this maximal value and that empty value to compose that string to update our table. And as this string contains a query, we may execute that query and update our table. So the only thing left is to increment that counter that stores the number of updated records. And that's all. To test this procedure in Microsoft SQL Server, you may execute such code. But once again, remember that once you've compressed a table, all further procedure executions with the same table will produce no changes. And of course, remember to make a backup of your database in order not to break anything. With Oracle, the idea is the same. Here we have to declare several variables, we have to prepare the string containing the query to search the empty values. Then we have to compose a string containing a query to search the maximum value of the primary key. And then we have to execute the loop with the main action inside. First, we are searching for the minimal empty value, and if there is no such value, we may exit the loop. Otherwise, we should search for the maximum primary key value, then we have to compose the string that contains the update query. Then we have to execute that query, and the only thing left is to increment that counter, and that's all. To test this procedure in Oracle, we have to create such unusual query. First, we have to declare this variable, and then we shall use this variable to store the information about the number of changed values. And then we may use such blocks of code to process any table in our database. But once again, please remember that only the first call of that procedure on a table will produce any result. All other calls will produce no changes. And of course, it's a good idea to make a backup of your database before executing these queries. In the second task, we have to create a stored procedure that makes a list of all views, triggers and foreign keys for a given table. This is a rather difficult technical task, so the result may vary depending on the implementation, but the general idea is here. So let's see the solution starting with MySQL. We have to create such procedure and we have to pass the table name as the input parameter. Then we have to compose a string that will contain the query to select the information about views, triggers and foreign keys for a given table. The information on how to acquire all those lists may be found in the DBMS documentation. Then in this statement we are replacing these placeholders, here they are, with the real table name that is in the input parameter of our stored procedure. And the only thing left is to prepare the executable statement, to execute it and to deallocate that statement. And that's all. To test this procedure in MySQL, you may execute such code. But please pay attention that the result may vary depending on your current database state. It asks what objects have you created, modified, dropped, changed, and so on and so on. For Microsoft SQL Server, the approach is the same. We are creating the procedure, we are passing the table name as the input parameter here. Then we are composing the string to obtain all those lists, and the information on how to compose such a query may be found in the DBMS documentation. Then we have to replace this placeholder, here it is, and here it is, with the real table name. And the only thing left is to execute that string that contains that query. And that's all. To test this procedure in Microsoft SQL Server, you have to execute such query. But once again, the result may vary depending on your current database state. In Oracle, we have to make an additional step. At last, we have to create a function that will return the list of views. First, we have to create such a structure, a data type that consists of two strings to store the information about view name and view body. Then we have to create a table that consists of that data types. And then inside the function body we have to populate this table with information about all views, and we shall return that table and we shall use it in a couple of seconds. And here is the main part of the solution. Here we also have to create that stored procedure with the input parameter, the table name, and the output parameter, the final result. Then, like in MySQL in Microsoft SQL Server, we have to compose such a string containing a query to acquire all those lists. And of course, the information about how to acquire all those lists may be found in the DBMS documentation. Finally, we have to replace the placeholder, here it is, and here it is, with a real table name, and then we have to execute the query. Unlike with MySQL and Microsoft SQL Server, it's not easy to obtain the final result in Oracle. Nevertheless, it's possible. Here we have to declare such variables, then we have to call our stored procedure, and then we have to loop through the results and print them to the screen. And finally, we have to remind you once again that the final result may vary depending on your current database state.